Athens said, "The individual has claims." The Persian Empire's model, benevolent, stable, ordered, said the opposite. Marathon is where those two answers fought each other on an open plain, and one of them won by a vote. The legacy runs even deeper when you look at religion. The New Testament was written in Greek, not because Jesus spoke Greek, he almost certainly didn't, speaking Aramaic, but because Greek was the universal language of the educated Mediterranean world, spread by Alexander's conquests, which were themselves downstream of Athenian philosophy. The specific language that Christianity used to formulate its theological concepts, logos, pneuma, hypostasis, ousia, were Greek philosophical terms. The early church councils that defined Christian doctrine in the 4th and 5th centuries CE argued in Greek philosophical vocabulary. Take away Greek intellectual culture, and Christianity develops differently. Perhaps not at all in recognizable form. What do you think would have survived, if anything, of Western democracy without Athens? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. Here is why this matters right now, in 2025, and not as an abstraction. The world is in the middle of the most significant debate about political systems since the Cold War. And the terms of that debate are almost exactly the same as the terms of the World Marathon decided. On one side, liberal democracy, individual rights, rule of law independent of executive power, freedom of speech, assembly, press. The idea that legitimate government derives its authority from the consent of the governed. On the other side, what political scientists now call civilizational authoritarianism. The Chinese Communist Party's explicit argument that Western liberal democracy is a culturally specific system, not a universal model, and that ordered, stable, technocratic governance produces better outcomes for more people. Russia's argument that liberal democracy is decadent, atomized, and destined to collapse. Iran's argument that divine law supersedes human legislative authority. These are not fringe positions. They represent the governing philosophy of nations containing roughly 1.6 billion people. And here is the uncomfortable historical truth. The authoritarian argument has an ancient precedent that is not obviously wrong. The Persian Empire's model, centralized, stable, ethnically and religiously tolerant within a hierarchical structure, lasted for 220 years. The Athenian democracy, in its pure, original form, lasted less than 200 years before being absorbed by Macedonia, then by Rome. Democracies are unstable. They produce faction, demagogy, and occasionally catastrophically bad collective decisions. Athens voted to invade Sicily in 415 BCE, one of the worst strategic decisions in military history, because a charismatic speaker convinced an assembly of citizens that the rewards were worth the risk. It wasn't. 40,000 Athenians died. The democracy never fully recovered. The Persian model didn't produce those mistakes, but it also didn't produce Socrates, the question Callimachus's vote actually decided. And the question the 21st century is re-asking is not which system is more stable. The Persians were more stable. It is which system produces the specific kind of human questioning, innovation, and self-correction that advances knowledge, individual dignity, and long-run human flourishing. That is not a question with an obvious answer. It is a question that Aristotle himself wrestled with. It is a question that is being answered right now in the competition between Silicon Valley and Zhongguancun. between the European Court of Human Rights and the National People's Congress, between an Iranian woman removing her hijab on a Tehran street and the morality police waiting at the corner. The Battle of Marathon didn't end in 490 BCE. It changed form. It is still being fought. And there's one dimension the counterfactual literature almost never discusses: science. The specific model of scientific inquiry that produced the modern world. Hypothesis, observation, logical proof, public peer challenge is a Greek invention. The Socratic method is not just a philosophical technique. It is the operating procedure of empirical science. You propose a claim, someone challenges it publicly, you defend it with evidence, the community evaluates. That process requires the freedom to be publicly wrong, to publicly challenge authority, to publicly revise. A tyranny doesn't produce that freedom. It produces compliance. The Islamic Golden Age, which preserved and extended Greek scientific knowledge through scholars like Al-Kindi and Ibn Rushd, was itself downstream of Greek texts transmitted through Alexandria. The European scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, drew directly on those recovered Greek and Arabic texts. The entire chain runs back through Alexandria, through Alexander, through Athens. The technology-driven world you live in, modern medicine, the internet, the device you're watching this on, is the end product of a chain of scientific development that traces its method back to a culture that required democratic conditions to produce it. One vote, one man, one morning. And none of it was inevitable, which is the most unsettling part of all. If this is the kind of history that actually explains the world you live in, not just the dates and the battles, but the why it matters now, then Fallen Empires was built for you. Subscribe and hit the bell. Every video we make connects an ancient collapse to something you'll read in the news this week. Now, the consequence almost no one includes in the marathon counterfactual, and the one that reaches deepest into the present. If Athens falls in 490 BCE, Alexander the Great does not happen. Not because Alexander wasn't born. He was born in 356 BCE, more than a century later in Macedonia. But because Macedonian Greece, without the intellectual inheritance of Athenian democracy and philosophy, does not produce the specific kind of ruler Alexander was. Alexander wasn't simply a conqueror. He was a conqueror shaped by Greek philosophical ideas about the universality of reason and the possibility of a cosmopolitan civilization. His campaign wasn't purely extractive. He founded cities, Alexandria in Egypt, Alexandria in Arachosia, Alexandria Eskate in modern Tajikistan, and staffed them with a mixture of Macedonians, Persians, and local populations governed by Greek administrative norms. He adopted Persian court customs himself. He married a Bactrian princess. He tried, imperfectly and often violently, to build a hybrid civilization. That hybridity was itself a Greek idea. Aristotle had taught Alexander that the polis, the city organized around rational laws and civic participation, was the highest form of human community. Alexander took that idea and tried to scale it across 3 continents. He failed, largely. The empire fell apart within a generation of his death. But the cities remained, and the cities did something that outlasted any military victory. They created a shared intellectual language. Alexandria in Egypt became the greatest library in the ancient world. It was where Euclidean geometry was compiled, where Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy, where the Hebrew scriptures were first translated into Greek, a translation called the Septuagint, which became the Bible of the early Christian church. The Septuagint matters more than almost anyone realizes for the shape of the modern world. When Paul of Tarsus wrote his letters, the core documents of early Christianity, he was not translating from Hebrew originals. He was working in Greek, from Greek concepts, citing a Greek Bible. The theological vocabulary he used, agape, logos, ekklesia, were Greek words with specific Greek philosophical histories. The church councils that defined Christian doctrine in Nicaea, 325 CE, Constantinople, 381 CE, and Chalcedon, 451 CE, the councils that decided what Christians would believe about the Trinity, about Christ's nature, about salvation, argued in Greek philosophical categories: hypostasis, ousia, homoousios. No Athens, no Plato, no Aristotle, no Alexander, no Alexandria, no Septuagint, no Greek-speaking Christianity. The modern Middle East, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the boundaries of Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, was shaped by the Ottoman Empire's collapse in 1918, which was shaped by the European powers' claims, which was shaped by centuries of Christian civilization and its specific political theology, which was shaped by Greek philosophical concepts transmitted through Alexandria. It is a cascade so long it becomes invisible, but every link is verifiable. Here is what Callimachus knew when he voted. He knew he was almost certainly going to die. The Polemarch's position in a hoplite battle was on the right flank, the place of honor, and the place of maximum risk. Callimachus led the Athenian right wing at Marathon. He died in the fighting. His name was inscribed on the Victory Monument. He had voted to attack knowing that a vote to attack meant he personally would be at the front of the charge. That detail changes the story. This wasn't a bureaucrat casting a procedural vote from a safe distance. This was a man choosing the most dangerous option, personally, because he believed it was the right one. He didn't just vote for the battle. He ran toward Persian archers on a September morning and died there. The 192 Athenians who died at Marathon are the smallest military casualty list of any decisive battle in Western history. Stalingrad killed 1 million. Verdun killed 700,000. Marathon, the battle that made all of those later battles possible and shaped the civilization that fought them, cost 192 men. History rarely gives us a hinge point that small. Now close all the loops. We started with a question. What if Callimachus had voted no? What if Athens had retreated? Hippias had been restored. The democracy had ended before it was 20 years old. Here is the full answer. No Persian defeat at Marathon means no Athenian confidence, no Themistocles, no fleet built from Laurion silver. Xerxes arrives in 480 BCE and meets no navy capable of stopping him at Salamis. Greece falls into the Persian client-state system, perhaps not brutally, but permanently. The specific conditions of Greek intellectual and democratic life, the competitive city-states, the public philosophical debate, the democratic assembly, do not survive Persian hegemony in any recognizable form. Without Athenian democracy, Socratic philosophy does not develop. Without Socrates, Plato doesn't write. Without Plato, Aristotle tutored at the academy, has no foundation. Without Aristotle, Alexander is tutored by someone else, or not at all. And his intellectual framework is different, more purely military, less cosmopolitan. Without Alexander's cosmopolitan model, Alexandria isn't built the way it was. Without Alexandria, the transmission of Greek philosophy into Roman thought is fractured. Without Greek philosophy in Roman thought, natural law, the idea that humans have rights prior to any government's permission, doesn't develop the same way. And without that idea, the American Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, has no philosophical ancestry to draw on. Thomas Jefferson didn't invent natural rights, he inherited them. From Locke, from Cicero, from the Stoics, from Aristotle, from the democracy that Callimachus voted to defend. None of this is inevitable. History is not a machine. Every one of these connections required specific people making specific choices in specific circumstances that could have gone differently. That's the thing about Marathon that should actually terrify you. It almost went the other way. Not because the Athenians were outmatched. They won decisively once they committed to fighting. But because they nearly didn't commit. Because a vote was split 5-5. Because one man who knew he was going to die for his decision chose to make it anyway. The entire inheritance of Western civilization, its philosophy, its legal systems, its religious language, its concept of individual rights, its model of democratic governance, was not inevitable. It was contingent. It depended on a morning in September, a plane by the sea, and a vote. Which empire do you want to watch fall next? Tell us in the comments. Your suggestion shapes the next video. And if you know someone who thinks history is just memorizing dates, share this with them. History isn't dates. History is the explanation for everything happening right now. The next Fallen Empires episode is already waiting for you. The morning is cold. The plane is still. 600 Persian ships sit in the Bay of Marathon, and inside the Athenian War Council, 10 generals are deadlocked. 5 say charge, 5 say retreat. One man hasn't voted yet. His name is Callimachus. He is the polemarch, the war archon, the ceremonial tiebreaker. He is not the greatest general in the room. He is not the wisest. He is simply the one whose vote counts twice. He votes to attack. Here is what most people don't know. Athens won at Marathon by a margin of approximately 6,400 Persian dead to 192 Athenians. It wasn't close. It was a slaughter. But the decision to fight at all, that was decided by a single vote in a room of 10 men. Change that one vote, and there is no Athenian democracy. No Athenian democracy, and the philosophical chain that runs from Socrates to Jefferson directly to the words, "All men are created equal," never forms. The conflict you read about this morning between liberal democracy and authoritarian states, that conflict has a specific origin point. It's a plain by the sea in 490 BCE, and a man named Callimachus who voted to fight. To understand what was at stake in 490 BCE, you have to understand what Athens actually was. Because what it was almost nobody got to keep. Athens in 490 BCE was less than 20 years old as a democracy. The reforms of Cleisthenes in 508 BCE had replaced the old aristocratic system with something genuinely new. Citizens organized into demes, voting in an assembly, serving on juries, holding the city's power not through bloodlines, but through participation. It was fragile, it was experimental, and almost every neighboring power thought it was a mistake. The Persian Empire, by contrast, was the largest political entity the ancient world had ever seen. Under Darius I, it stretched from the Indus River in modern Pakistan to Libya in North Africa, roughly 5 million square kilometers, 30 nations, 70 languages. It had absorbed every political system it encountered: Babylonian bureaucracy, Egyptian temple organization, Lydian coinage, Scythian cavalry. It didn't destroy what it conquered, it processed it, integrated it, and moved on. Athens, to Darius, wasn't a civilizational threat, it was a minor irritant. 2 years earlier, Athens had made the mistake of helping the Ionian Greek cities rebel against Persian rule. The revolt failed. The Persians burned Miletus, the intellectual capital of the Greek world, the city where Thales, Anaximander, and Heraclitus had first asked questions about the nature of reality and sold its population into slavery. Darius sent his generals west with a specific instruction: bring him the Athenians who helped the rebels. Not to destroy Athens, to punish it, to make an example, to remind the Greek world who held power in the eastern Mediterranean. The Persian force that landed at Marathon numbered between 20,000 and 25,000 soldiers. Modern historians have revised the ancient Greek claims of 100,000 significantly downward, but 25,000 was still an overwhelming force against Athens' 10,000 citizen hoplites and 1,000 Plataean allies. The Persians had cavalry, they had archers, they had the memory of Miletus burning. The Athenian generals knew the odds. That's why the council was split. The cautious faction, led by a general named Aristides, argued for waiting inside Athens' walls, hope for reinforcements from Sparta, preserve the army, don't risk everything on open ground against superior numbers. This was not cowardice. It was logic. Every military calculation pointed toward survival through delay. Miltiades argued the opposite. And here is the argument that changed everything. A Persian victory on the plain was survivable. A Persian siege, followed by a negotiated surrender, followed by the installation of the tyrant Hippias, whom the Persians had brought along on their ships specifically for this purpose, was not. Hippias, the former tyrant of Athens, had promised Persian gold and Persian backing in exchange for his restoration. A surrender at Marathon wouldn't just end the battle, it would end the democracy. It would restore the exact regime that Athens had just spent 20 years dismantling. This is the detail most history classes omit. There was a collaborator on those Persian ships. Hippias was waiting. A Persian victory at Marathon wasn't a foreign occupation. It was a coup. If you're finding this as eye-opening as the people who subscribed when we covered Thermopylae, hit subscribe. This channel exists to tell you the version that actually makes sense of the present. Callimachus's vote gave Miltiades command. And Miltiades did something the Persians had never seen. He thinned his center, weighted his flanks, and ran. Hoplites, running. Across a mile of open ground at full speed. closing the gap before Persian archers could draw a second volley. The flanks hit the Persian lines, folded inward, and trapped the center against the sea. In less than 3 hours, it was over. But the real battle, the one whose outcome we're still living in, was just beginning. What would a Persian victory at Marathon have actually looked like? Not an invasion of Europe. Not Persian boots marching through Rome. That's the cinematic fantasy, and it misses the actual mechanism of how Athens would have fallen and what its fall would have meant. Here's what the evidence tells us would have happened. After a Persian victory at Marathon, whether by breaking the Athenian line or simply by the Athenians retreating into the city, Darius had no interest in a prolonged occupation. Persian imperial strategy was almost never direct annexation in the Greek world. It was client states, friendly tyrannies, local rulers who owed their position to Persian backing and kept their populations compliant with the threat of what happened to Miletus. Hippias would have been installed as tyrant within weeks. The democracy, Athens' 18-year-old democratic experiment, would have been dismantled. The Council of 500 dissolved, the assembly abolished, the demes reorganized under aristocratic control. Not because Persia hated democracy specifically, but because a tyrant is easier to control than a citizenry. Hippias knew how to run Athens, and Athens, exhausted and garrisoned, would have complied. Here is the first consequence that reaches directly to you. Socrates would almost certainly never have existed as a philosopher. Not because he wouldn't have been born. He was born in 470 BCE, 20 years after Marathon. But because the specific conditions that made Socratic philosophy possible, the democratic agora, the culture of public debate, the Athenian tradition of citizens arguing in assembly, those were products of the democracy. A tyranny doesn't produce the Socratic method. It produces silence. Calculated, strategic silence. Most historians locate the birth of Western philosophy in Athens' democratic culture. I think that's exactly right, and it's routinely underweighted. The freedom to publicly challenge authority, to argue that the magistrate is wrong, to ask what is justice in front of witnesses without being imprisoned for sedition, that was a democratic product. Socrates annoyed the democracy so much they eventually executed him. A tyrant would have dealt with him at the first public performance. No Socrates, then almost certainly no Plato. And if no Plato, then Aristotle, tutored at Plato's academy, has no foundation. The philosophical tradition that ran Athens to Socrates, to Plato, to Aristotle, to Alexander wasn't an academic sequence. It was a transmission of the idea that the world could be understood, ordered, and governed through reason. Break the democracy at Marathon, and you lose the specific intellectual ferment that required democratic conditions to exist. And there's another casualty rarely mentioned in this context. Aeschylus. The playwright Aeschylus fought at Marathon. He considered it the defining event of his life. His epitaph, which he apparently wrote himself, doesn't mention his plays at all. It says only that he fought at Marathon. His tragedies, the Oresteia, the Persians, Prometheus Bound, introduced moral conflict into theatrical storytelling. The protagonist undone not by external enemies, but by internal contradictions. Choices that are simultaneously right and wrong. That structure, the tragic hero, runs from Aeschylus to Shakespeare to every serious film being made today. Under a Persian-backed tyranny, Aeschylus does not stage those plays publicly because the Athenian theater festivals were civic events funded by the democracy judged by citizen panels. A tyrant's court entertainment doesn't produce the Oresteia. And the loss of the tragic dramatic tradition is the loss of the storytelling mode that taught Western civilization to take moral complexity seriously, to believe that good people make catastrophic errors, that justice can conflict with justice, that no authority is beyond questioning. But there's a more immediate cascade, one that plays out not in centuries, but in years. 10 years after Marathon, Persia returned. In 480 BCE, Xerxes, Darius's son, came back with the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever assembled. Ancient sources claim 2 million soldiers. Modern historians estimate 100,000 to 150,000, plus a navy of perhaps 1,200 warships. The numbers are still almost incomprehensible. This was not a punitive expedition. This was an attempt to absorb Greece entirely into the Persian Empire. Athens survived 480 BCE for one reason: the Battle of Salamis. At Salamis, the Athenian navy, 200 trireme warships, drew the Persian fleet into a narrow strait and destroyed it. Persia without its navy couldn't supply an army of 150,000 men through a Greek winter. Xerxes retreated. His general Mardonius stayed, was defeated at Plataea in 479 BCE, and the Persian threat to mainland Greece was over. Now run the counterfactual. If Athens falls at Marathon in 490 BCE and Hippias is restored as tyrant, what does the Athenian navy look like in 480 BCE when Xerxes arrives? It doesn't exist. The 200 trireme navy that won at Salamis was built between 483 and 480 BCE, using revenue from a silver strike at Laurion. The decision to build that navy, rather than distributing the silver to Athenian citizens, was made by Themistocles, an elected Athenian politician, through the Democratic Assembly. A tyranny doesn't make that decision. A tyrant doesn't build a navy that empowers the lower-class rowers, the thetes, who become its backbone, and then demand political rights in return for their service. A tyrant distributes the silver as patronage, builds a smaller fleet under direct control, and waits. No democratic assembly, no Themistocles, no Athenian navy. Persia wins at Salamis by default. And here is where most counterfactual analyses of Marathon stop. Because the conclusion seems obvious: Persia conquers Greece. But the more important question isn't what Persia conquers, it's what doesn't develop. The city-state system, Athens, Corinth, Sparta, Thebes, arguing, competing, often at war, produced something the Persian Empire never had: the idea that there was more than one right way to organize a society. That plurality is the direct ancestor of the political diversity of the modern West. Persian hegemony would not have been brutal. The Persian Empire was, by the standards of the ancient world, genuinely tolerant of local customs, religions, and languages. But it was singular: one king, one model of power. The Zoroastrian moral framework of Ahura Mazda, cosmic order, the eternal battle between truth and the lie, was not a blueprint for pluralism. It was a blueprint for a divinely ordered hierarchy with the king at the top. The question isn't whether Greece under Persia would have been miserable. Many people who lived under Persian rule were not miserable. The question is whether the specific intellectual and political ferment that required Greek city-state independence The arguments, the philosophy, the democratic experiments could have survived? The answer is almost certainly no. The Persian Empire's political model was divine kingship. The great king as the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda's cosmic order. Citizens could petition the king, they could practice their religions, they could trade. What they could not do was vote their rulers out of power, or stand in a public square and argue that the law itself was unjust. Under a Persian-backed tyranny, that practice ends within a generation. The world that doesn't have marathon in it may have been, for most people most of the time, more stable and more comfortable. But it would not be the world you live in. Aristotle's Politics, written in Athens between 335 and 323 BCE, is the first systematic attempt in human history to categorize, compare, and evaluate different forms of government. Monarchy, oligarchy, democracy, tyranny, polity. Aristotle identified them, described them, ranked them, and asked which produced the best human life. That framework, that question, is the foundation of every political science course taught in every American university today. The Roman Republic absorbed Aristotle's framework through Greek tutors and Greek philosophy. Cicero's De Republica, the foundational text of Roman Republican thought, is explicitly in conversation with Plato and Aristotle. Roman jurists built the concept of natural law, the idea that there are rights that exist prior to any specific government's commands, directly from Greek Stoic philosophy. The Stoics were a Greek school. They existed because Athens existed as a free city where philosophical schools could compete publicly. Natural law to Roman jurisprudence, to medieval canon law, to Magna Carta, to English common law, to the American Constitution. That is a direct line. Historians trace it. Judges cite it. It isn't metaphor. Now, here is the connection that most people miss entirely, and it matters for the world you read about in the news today. The concept of individual rights as something that exists independently of the state, that a person has claims against the government, not just from the government, that specific idea is not universal. It is not found in Chinese political philosophy. It is not the organizing principle of Islamic jurisprudence, which grounds rights in divine command rather than natural law. It is not the framework of Russian political tradition, which historically centers on collective obligation to the state rather than individual claims against it. It is a specifically Western inheritance, and its specific origin is in Greek democratic thought. The idea that a citizen has standing to challenge the city, that Socrates can stand in the agora and publicly argue that the magistrate is wrong. The modern conflict between Western liberalism and authoritarian systems, whether in China, Russia, or Iran, is, at its philosophical core, a conflict between two different answers to a question first posed clearly in Athens. Does the individual have claims against the state, or does the state have claims against the individual?